The old town lay quiet under the pale gold of a late afternoon sun, its dirt streets empty except for the faint rattle of a wagon rolling off toward the horizon. Weathered buildings leaned against one another like old men with tired bones, their wooden signs creaking in the dry wind. It was the kind of place where time had slowed down, maybe even forgotten, leaving behind echoes of gun smoke, whispered prayers, and the weight of lives lived hard. And out there, where the land stretched wider than any man's pride, a lonely cowboy rode with nothing but his horse, his silence, and the scars that never healed. He had once been a man with laughter in his voice and warmth in his chest. That was long before loss carved him hollow, before betrayal hardened him into someone who no longer believed in belonging. Folks in the village spoke of him in hushed tones, calling him strange, even cursed, because he kept to himself and avoided the company of others. He didn't argue with them. He didn't much care anymore. His only comfort was the endless ride across the prairies, where he could outrun memories even if only for a day. The land itself carried stories older than the town, older than any cowboy's grief. Rolling hills faded into broken mesas, and rivers cut deep scars through the earth. Every rock and tree seemed to hold secrets, and for centuries, different people had claimed this soil as home. The Apache called the desert their mother, the place of strength and spirit. But for the cowboy, it was only an empty stage where his life played out like a worn-out ballad. He had no kin to return to, no woman waiting for him, no reason to fight for tomorrow until the day he found something he wasn't looking for. It happened on a morning heavy with silence, the kind that feels like a warning. He had been trailing cattle thieves for 2 nights, following the faint prints they left across dry ground. The chase had driven him deeper into canyons where shadows clung like wolves. His horse grew uneasy, tossing its head, ears pricked at sounds too faint for him to catch. That was when he saw her swift as a wild deer, her figure cutting across the rocks above. At first, he thought she was a scout from the thieves, but the truth carried a sharper sting. She was young, wrapped in colors of earth and sky, with dark hair unbound and eyes that flashed with fire. She wasn't running from him, but from something else, something that made her stumble, desperate, almost breathless. He didn't know who she was, only that she wasn't meant to be there alone. Instinct and caution urged him to keep his distance, but fate has its own cruel humor. In a tangle of fear and chance, he caught her roped like a wild horse before he even thought about what he was doing. She fought him with all the strength she had, her eyes blazing with pride and defiance. Her words came sharp in a tongue he didn't understand, but he didn't need translation to know she cursed at him. He hadn't meant to capture her, yet there she was, bound to him by accident, by a moment he could not undo. She was Apache, and he knew what that meant. Bringing her to town would set fire to both their lives, and letting her go might bring her enemies back upon her trail. The cowboy stared at her, torn between fear, duty, and something else he couldn't name. He had spent years closing his heart, and yet, in the midst of dust and silence, he felt a strange stirring. She was not a thief. She was not his enemy. She was something unexpected, something alive in a world that had grown dead for him. But what was he to do with her? He led her down the canyon, his grip firm on the rope, though his mind spun with doubt. The sky darkened overhead, clouds gathering like watchmen, and the land seemed to hold its breath. Each step forward pulled him deeper into a story he had never planned to live, one that bound him to a woman whose people had known pain as deep as his own. He didn't yet realize that the very woman he held against her will would soon become the one to heal what he thought could never be mended. But as twilight bled across the desert and coyotes cried in the distance, one truth pressed heavier than the weight of his saddle. The world would not forgive a cowboy and an Apache woman crossing paths like this. Both their lives hung in the balance, balanced on the edge of trust and ruin. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, didn't even know if she would live through the night. The horse shifted beneath him, uneasy, as if sensing what lay ahead. The woman's dark eyes met his, filled with a defiance that refused to bow, even in capture. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that gaze, two broken souls bound by accident, by fate, by something neither could yet understand. And then, far off in the canyon, came the sound of riders, many riders. Dust rising, steel glinting in the fading light. Whoever hunted her was closing in, and the cowboy realized too late that by catching her, he had caught himself in a storm that might just cost him everything. Would he stand and fight for someone he barely knew? Or would he ride away, leaving her to a fate he couldn't bear to imagine? The answer hung in the desert air, heavy, waiting like a gun not yet fired, like a heart not yet healed. The sound of those riders carried through the canyon like a storm rolling over open plains. The cowboy felt his chest tighten as he pulled his horse to a halt, his hand instinctively brushing the worn grip of the revolver at his side. The Apache woman did not flinch. Her head turned toward the echo of hooves, her dark eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and fury. Whoever they were, she knew them. He didn't need her words to understand that danger was closing fast. The desert wind picked up, sweeping dust around them, carrying the scent of mesquite and something heavier, like smoke from far-off fire. The cowboy tugged at the reins, guiding his horse toward a ridge where they could gain some cover, but the woman jerked against the rope binding her hands, slowing him, almost as if she would rather face whatever came than ride away with him. He cursed under his breath, frustration biting as hard as the desert grit against his teeth. He had never asked for this. He never wanted to be responsible for another soul again, yet here he was, tangled in a fight he didn't even understand. His mind flickered back to the town he had left behind, that weathered little place where life moved slow but judgment traveled fast. He pictured the faces of men who leaned against the saloon posts, eyes sharp, whispering whenever he walked by. He had no friends there, not anymore. The memory of laughter shared at long tables and nights under lantern glow had dried up years ago. Too many mistakes, too much heartache, and too little reason left for them to welcome him back. And yet, even among all that loneliness, he had never felt the heat of eyes like the woman staring through him now, steady and unyielding, as though she could see beyond his hardened shell into the bruises he thought he had buried. The sound of the riders grew closer, louder, spilling over stone and brush like thunder. He knew he couldn't take them all if they were armed, not with one rifle and a half-empty cylinder. But he also knew turning her loose in that canyon would be as good as signing her death sentence. Whatever chased her wasn't coming to talk. He could tell by the way her breath quickened, by the slight tremor in her shoulders she tried to hide. He spurred the horse up a narrow path between jagged rocks, pulling her along beside him. She stumbled once, nearly falling, but when he reached down to steady her, she jerked away, her pride refusing his help. It stung him, though he couldn't say why. Maybe because he saw himself in that stubborn fire, the same refusal to bow even. When the world pressed down with both hands, when they reached the crest, he looked back. In the fading light, dust clouds rose from the canyon floor. Dark figures rode hard, their shapes blurred but their intent sharp as blades. The cowboy swallowed hard, weighing his choices. If he rode back toward town, the trouble would follow him straight to those quiet streets, and the townsfolk would never forgive him. If he rode deeper into Apache land, he risked disappearing into a place where men like him were not meant to survive. Either way, the road ahead was thick with peril. Woman's gaze followed his, and for the briefest moment her eyes softened. It was not trust, not yet, but something closer to recognition. As if she knew he stood at the same edge she had walked all her life, where survival depended on choices that tore at the soul. He wondered if she could feel the weight in his chest, the weight of every grave he had dug in his memory, every face he could no longer save. The horse shifted restlessly beneath him, ears pricked at the sound of pursuit. He turned away from the canyon and pressed forward into the wilderness, guiding them toward a dry riverbed that wound like a scar through the land. The woman stumbled along, silent now, her eyes searching the horizon as if she knew the ground better than he ever could. He realized then that she might be the only compass between him and ruin, though he doubted she would ever choose to guide him. Night fell heavy and quick in the desert. The stars cut sharp and cold against the sky, and the chill crept in with every breath. He made a small fire in the shadow of a cliff, its flames low so as not to draw attention. The woman sat across from him, her hands still bound, though he loosened the rope enough for her to move. She would not eat the bread he offered, only sat with her eyes fixed on the flames, her face unreadable. He studied her in the flicker, trying to piece together who she was, what had driven her into the canyon alone, why she had been running. Questions burned in his throat, but he knew she would not answer. Not yet. By morning, the tracks of the riders had drawn closer. He found prints in the dirt near the riverbed, fresh enough to stir dread in his gut. Whoever they were relentless. He looked at the woman, wondering again who she was to draw. Such a hunt. His life had been marked by solitude, by a promise never to let another's burden become his own. But somehow, by accident or fate, her burden was now tied to his saddle, as heavy as his own grief. As the day stretched on, the desert opened wider, exposing them beneath the endless sky. Heat shimmered off the earth, and each mile felt longer than the last. He found himself glancing at her more often than he cared to admit, catching the way her chin lifted against exhaustion, the way her steps refused to falter even when the ground cut her bare feet raw. Strength lived in her bones, a kind he had not seen in years, and against his will, it stirred something long buried in him. Yet every glance also reminded him of the storm chasing them. He knew the world would not forgive what had begun in that canyon. A lonely cowboy with no place in his own town, and a young Apache woman whose people carried a history of loss just as sharp as his own. Their paths were not meant to cross, and if they did, blood would follow. Still, when the sun began to fall again, painting the desert in shades of fire and ash, he caught her looking at him differently. Her eyes were no longer filled only with defiance. There was something else there, faint but undeniable, as if she too recognized that the road ahead was no longer hers alone to walk. The cowboy shifted in his saddle, uneasy with the thought. He had not asked for this, had not wanted it, yet he could not bring himself to cut the rope that bound her to him. For reasons he did not yet dare to name, he feared what might happen if he let her go, not only for her sake, but for his own. And as the desert swallowed the last light of day, the sound of distant gunfire cracked against the horizon, sharp and merciless, a reminder that the hunt was far from over. The gunfire echoed across the desert like a curse, rolling through the canyons and rattling in the cowboy's chest. He pulled the reins tight, eyes sweeping the horizon, but the fading light made it near impossible to see. His instincts screamed that the shots weren't meant for hunting game, they were a warning, or worse, a signal. Whoever was chasing the Apache woman was close enough now to announce their presence. She stood silent beside him, her wrists still loosely bound, though she no longer fought against the rope. Her face remained calm, but her eyes darted to the horizon, sharp as a hawk's. She knew the land, knew the sound of rifles, and knew better than he ever could that death was drawing near. The cowboy felt the weight of her silence pressing heavier than any words. He was alone in his choices, yet not alone in the danger. He decided to move them under the cover of darkness, hoping the hunters would ride past if they left no fire, no tracks easy to follow. They rode quietly, hooves muffled in the sandy riverbed. The stars burned above them, cold and distant, as though the heavens themselves refused to meddle in the affairs of broken men and hunted women. Every so often, the woman would glance back, as if measuring the distance between life and death, and though she said nothing, her silence carried a warning sharper than steel. As they traveled deeper into the desert, the cowboy's mind drifted. He thought of the life he once had, of a homestead that now lay in ruins, of a woman he had loved and lost when fever swept through the valley. The loneliness that had clung to him for years felt heavier now, not because of his grief, but because of the living reminders sitting behind him on the horse. This young Apache woman had her own scars, her own enemies, yet she carried herself with strength he had nearly forgotten existed. He wondered if her spirit came from the land itself, from centuries of fighting to hold on to what little could not be stolen. But he knew better than to believe. Strength was enough. Men with rifles and horses could crush even the proudest spirit, if given the chance. That truth haunted him with every step his horse took into the darkness. By morning, they reached the edge of the high desert where scrub brush gave way to rolling hills dotted with cottonwoods. A thin stream cut through the valley, offering water for both horse and rider. They rested there, but the peace felt fragile. The cowboy could see fresh tracks in the soft dirt by the water hoof prints, not their own. He crouched low, studying the ground. At least half a dozen men had passed through, and not long ago. The woman stood a short distance away, her eyes fixed on the trees as if listening to voices only she could hear. For the first time, she spoke words he understood. "They? Come," she said softly, her voice rough but steady. It startled him, hearing her speak his tongue, even if only 2 words. He wanted to ask how many, how close, but her gaze told him all he needed to know. The riders would not give up until they had her buried. He led them away from the stream, keeping to higher ground. The land stretched wide, but with every mile, the weight of pursuit grew heavier. He wondered who these men were. Were they soldiers, bounty hunters, or raiders? Had they taken her from her people, or was she fleeing some punishment he did not yet understand? The questions gnawed at him, but answers never came. She would not tell him. Not yet. As the hours stretched on, he found his thoughts circling back to the town he had left behind. He imagined what folks would say if he rode in with an Apache woman bound to his saddle. They would not ask why, nor listen to reason. To them, she would be nothing but a danger, and he would be a fool or a traitor for bringing her there. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to let her go. When night fell again, they made camp in a narrow ravine where brush and stone offered cover. He gave her water first, then bread, and though she hesitated, this time she accepted. He saw the weariness in her eyes, the exhaustion in her limbs, but also the unbroken flame of defiance. She was not someone who would yield easily, even to hunger or fear. He watched her from across the fireless camp, wondering what twist of fate had bound their lives together. He was a man who had spent years running from ghosts, and she was a woman with enemies pressing hard at her back. 2 lost souls, forced onto the same trail, with dangers snapping at their heels. The gunfire returned the next day, closer now, joined by the distant cry of men. The cowboy drove his horse faster, the woman clinging tightly as the land blurred past. Bullets struck the rocks behind them, sending stone splinters flying. Whoever these men were, they were close enough to kill. He veered sharply into the canyons, weaving through narrow passages where the enemy's horses would struggle to follow. The woman's sharp eyes guided him, her hand once tugging the reins to steer them away from a dead end he would have missed. He realized then that though she was bound, she was not helpless. Her knowledge of the land was the only thing keeping them alive. They managed to lose the riders for a time, but the tension never eased. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound a warning. The cowboy's nerves frayed, though he hid it behind silence. He had been hunted before, but never with another life tied to his own. That night, as the moon rose over the canyon walls, he heard her voice again, low and steady. She spoke words he could not fully understand, her native tongue flowing like a prayer. He sat listening, struck by the strength in her tone, the way the syllables carried both sorrow and hope. He realized she was not speaking to him, but to the land, to her ancestors, to the spirits that watched over her. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest, a reminder of belief, of faith, of things greater than a man's grief. But even as her words lingered in the night, he knew the danger had not passed. Somewhere beyond the canyon walls, men with rifles were closing in, their determination as relentless as the desert sun. And though the cowboy had always ridden alone, always carried his burdens without sharing them, he now carried hers too. It was a weight he could not set down, no matter how heavy it became. He did not yet know if she would come to trust him, nor if he could ever trust her. But one truth stood clear as the desert stars. Their fates were tied together now. Bound by accident and hunted by forces neither could escape. And as dawn crept into the sky, painting the canyon walls in shades of blood and gold, the cowboy knew the true fight had only just begun. The road ahead was darker than any he had ridden before, and the choices he made would either save them or destroy them both. The days that followed blurred into a relentless chase, the desert giving no mercy. Each sunrise brought with it the same question: would they survive to see the next? The cowboy and the Apache woman moved like shadows, slipping through canyons and over ridges, always listening for the thunder of hooves behind them. Sleep came in fragments, food in scraps, and trust, if it existed at all, was thin as a thread. Yet still they pressed on, each step pulling them deeper into land that felt both cursed and alive. The cowboy had grown used to loneliness, to the silence of long rides where only his horse kept him company. But this silence was different. The woman's presence filled it with unspoken weight, her dark eyes watching him, measuring him, though she rarely spoke. When she did, it was short and sharp, words that carried more meaning in their quiet than his own ever could. He found himself listening for her voice in the night, straining to catch even a fragment of her language, though he understood little. It unsettled him, the way her silence pressed into him more than any man's shout ever had. The riders never let up. Sometimes they caught glimpses of dust on the horizon, sometimes the echo of gunfire, sometimes the fleeting shadow of men moving fast in the distance. Whoever they were disciplined, relentless, and closing the gap. The cowboy. New men like that didn't chase unless they had something worth chasing. That truth gnawed at him. Who was this woman, and what power did she carry that so many would risk dying to reclaim her? On the third night after the canyon shots, they took shelter in a dry cave carved into a hillside. The air inside was cool, smelling faintly of earth, and old smoke as if others had once used it for the same purpose. The cowboy built no fire. Instead, he sat in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of his horse outside, and to the quiet movements of the woman beside him. She sat with her knees drawn up, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, her eyes shining faintly in the thin light from the cave's mouth. "Why did they hunt you?" he asked at last, his voice low, roughened by dust and weariness. She looked at him for a long time before answering. When she spoke, her words were careful, her accent thick but clear enough. "They take me, not my people, not my blood. They steal." She paused, her gaze drifting to the cave wall as though she saw something beyond it. "I run. They want me back." The cowboy frowned, piecing together what little he could. Taken from her people, stolen like cattle or coin. He'd heard stories of raiders, of traders who dealt in human lives, of soldiers who cared nothing for those who stood in their path. His gut tightened. He had never thought much beyond his own loss, his own broken heart, but the thought of her stolen from her home stirred something raw inside him. "You go back," she said suddenly, her voice carrying both command and warning. "No belong with me. You go back, live." The cowboy stared at her, the words sharp as a knife. He should have wanted nothing more. He should have cut the rope and let her vanish into the desert, free to meet whatever fate awaited her. But something in her eyes held him fast, something that refused to let him turn away. "Too late for that," he muttered, more to himself and to her. By dawn, the decision weighed heavier. He could see smoke rising far off in the east, too straight and steady to be anything but campfires. The riders were close. He led her north, deeper into the hills, where jagged rocks jutted like teeth from the earth. The trail was harder, but the cover better. Still, his nerves burned with every sound, every crack of stone under hoof, every rustle of brush that might hide an ambush. The woman moved with quiet resilience, never complaining, though exhaustion lined her face. Once, as they paused by a trickling spring, she touched her bound wrists and then looked at him. No words passed between them, but he saw the question in her eyes. For a long moment, he hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he cut the rope. She didn't run. She simply rubbed her wrists, lifted her chin, and walked beside him as if nothing had changed. That small act unsettled him more than anything, the trust she had not spoken, but had silently claimed. The nights grew harsher. Coyotes circled, their cries carrying through the dark, but it wasn't the wild that set his nerves on edge. It was the silence between gunshots, the feeling of being watched. More than once he woke with the hairs on his neck standing, certain that eyes were on him from the shadows. Each morning he found fresh tracks nearby, closer than before. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, they reached the edge of a narrow valley. The woman stopped, her hand brushing his arm. Her gaze fixed ahead. He followed her stare. Down below, campfires flickered, small but many. Figures moved in the firelight, men with rifles, horses tied in clusters. The riders had set their camp square across the valley floor, a barrier they could not cross without being seen. The cowboy's jaw tightened. They were trapped between the valley and the desert behind them, the noose tightening with every hour. He weighed his choices, none of them good. They could turn back and risk the open desert, or they could try to slip past the camp under the cover of darkness. Either way, danger was certain. The woman looked at him, her eyes steady, unflinching. She knew as well as he did that the time for running was almost over. The fight was coming, whether they wanted it or not. That night, they lay hidden among the rocks, watching the fires below. The cowboy could hear the laughter of the riders, the clink of metal, the restless stamping of horses. He felt the old stirrings of fear and resolve battling in his chest, the same mix he had felt years ago when he buried the people he loved. Back then, he had turned away, choosing solitude over pain. But now, with the Apache woman beside him, the choice was not so simple. She whispered something in her language, words soft as wind. Though he didn't understand, he felt the weight of them. A prayer, a promise, or perhaps a farewell. It struck him then that she might be braver than he had ever been, facing the fire not with bitterness but with a heart still unbroken. The cowboy's hand rested on the worn grip of his revolver. He knew the cylinder was nearly empty. His rifle carried only a handful of rounds. Against so many, his odds were slim. But when he looked at her, he found himself thinking not of death, but of something he hadn't felt in years, a reason worth fighting for. The moon rose high, bathing the valley in silver light. The fires below crackled, their shadows stretching long across the ground. The cowboy tightened the strap on his saddle, his breath slow, steady, though his heart hammered. The Apache woman stood at his side, her face calm, her eyes fierce. And then, from the valley below, a horn sounded low, harsh, cutting through the night like a blade. Men rose from their fires, rifles in hand, their voices carrying up into the dark. The cowboys got twisted. They weren't waiting. They were moving. The hunt was over. The fight had come. The cowboy glanced once at the woman, her face unreadable in the moonlight. For the first time, he felt something close to trust pass between them, unspoken but real. Together they turned toward the narrowing path ahead, knowing that the night would decide more than their fate. It would decide whether two broken souls could withstand the storm that bore down upon them. The ground trembled with the force of approaching riders. Dust rose in the moonlight, rifles gleamed, and voices echoed like thunder. The cowboy drew his revolver, the weight of it cold in his hand, his breath sharp in the night air. Every nerve in his body braced for the clash, for the storm that could not be outrun. And as the first rider's shadow broke into the clearing, the cowboy knew the moment he had dreaded and awaited had finally arrived. The first rider burst from the dust with rifle raised, his horse charging hard up the incline. The cowboy squeezed the trigger, the revolver kicking back in his hand. The shot cracked through the night and the rider tumbled from the saddle, his horse rearing and bolting into the darkness. Shouts rose from below, voices sharp and angry. And then the thunder of more hooves shook the ground. The Apache woman stood at his side, her chin lifted, her eyes burning with a fierce calm. She did not run. She waited, steady, as though she had already known this moment would come. The cowboy fired again, then again, each bullet striking sparks off rock as riders swarmed the slope. His rifle barked once, twice before he ducked behind stone, fumbling. To reload, the woman's hand pressed against his arm, pulling him toward a narrow path that wound higher up the canyon wall. He followed her, trusting her knowledge of the land more than his own instinct. Bullets struck around them, dust rising, stone splintering, but they pressed forward, climbing higher into the shelter of the cliffs. They ran until the sound of gunfire faded behind them, until only the pounding of their hearts and the rasp of their breaths filled the air. The cowboy staggered against the rock, his chest heaving, his revolver nearly empty. The woman turned to him, her dark hair wild in the wind, her face lit by moonlight. For the first time since he had captured her, she touched his shoulder, not in anger or resistance, but in quiet gratitude. He understood then that whatever wall stood between them had cracked. They found refuge in a hidden hollow, shielded by brush and stone. There, with dawn creeping pale across the desert sky, the dia. Cowboy listened as the woman finally spoke her story. She told him of her people, of how raiders had come under the guise of traders, stealing her away from her family. She had been taken to be sold, a prize for men who saw her not as human but as property. She had escaped before they could finish their trade, but the men who hunted her would not stop until she was either recaptured or dead. Her voice carried no self-pity, only a quiet strength that made the cowboy's chest ache. For years he had lived with his own pain, convinced it was his alone to bear. But hearing her story, he realized her scars ran just as deep, carved by hands just as cruel as the fate that had stolen his loved ones. And yet, where he had turned to silence and bitterness, she had turned to fire and survival. In her, he saw the courage he had lost. They rested only briefly before moving again. The riders were relentless, and the cowboy knew they would not give up. But with each step, he also knew he could not abandon her. Not now. Something had shifted inside him during the long chase, something he had thought was gone forever. A sense of purpose, faint but undeniable, had returned. Protecting her meant more than survival. It meant redemption. The next days tested them both. They crossed barren plains where heat pressed down like a hammer. climbed ridges where jagged stone tore at their boots, and forded rivers swollen with spring melt. Sometimes they traveled in silence. Sometimes she whispered words in her tongue, teaching him fragments of her language. He fumbled, but she would allow the faintest smile when he managed to repeat them correctly. Those small moments, fragile as they were, became lifelines. At last, they reached the edge of a valley unlike the others. Smoke rose there too, but not from raiders' fires. This smoke rose from cook fires and hearths, from a camp alive with families. Children's laughter carried faintly on the breeze, mingling with the low hum of voices. The woman's steps quickened, her eyes shining. She knew this place. Her people were near, but before relief could settle, the thunder of hooves erupted. Once more, the riders had tracked them, circling the valley, cutting them off before they could reach safety. The cowboy's gut twisted. He had only a handful of bullets left, no high ground to defend, no time to plan. The woman stood tall, facing the oncoming storm with no fear. He stepped forward ready to fight until there was nothing left. Riders came hard and fast, their shouts carrying across the valley. The cowboy fired, dropping one, then another, but the rest closed in, rifles raised. Just when the noose seemed ready to snap, a new sound split the air, the sharp call of horns, the cry of voices not of the raiders but of the Apache. From the valley below, warriors rose like shadows, arrows and bullets flying as they charged to meet the threat. The battle was swift and fierce. The raiders, outnumbered and caught between two fires, broke and fled, their horses scattering into the desert. The cowboy stood amid the chaos, his revolver empty, his chest burning with exhaustion. The woman raised her voice in her language, calling out to her people, and in moments she was surrounded by them, men, women, and children rushing forward, embracing her, welcoming her home. The cowboy watched, silent, as she reunited with her kin. Relief washed over him, but also something bittersweet. He had brought her this far, but now she was where she belonged. He was still what he had always been, a wanderer, a man without roots. Yet as she turned back to him, her eyes meeting his across the crowd, he felt something shift again. She stepped forward, her hand brushing his, her gaze filled with gratitude deeper than words. The Apache elders approached, their faces stern but not unkind. Through her, they spoke to him, offering thanks for returning one of their own. They knew he had risked his life for her, though he had no obligation. For that, they offered him food, water, and safe passage. He accepted with a nod, though part of him longed to stay, to rest, to belong. In the days that followed, he lingered at the edge of their camp. He shared meals, listened to their stories, and learned pieces of their world. The woman often sat with him, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, but always near. In her presence, the sharp edges of his loneliness softened. She did not mend his broken heart with promises or tenderness, but simply by showing him that even broken hearts could beat again when given purpose. When the time came for him to leave, he saddled his horse with quiet hands. The camp stirred around him, but she came alone to where he stood. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she placed her hand over his, her eyes steady, her voice soft. "You are not alone," she said, the words broken but clear. The cowboy swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotions he had not let himself feel in years. He nodded once, unable to speak. Then he mounted his horse and turned toward the open land. The horizon stretched wide before him, filled with both danger and promise. Behind him, the campfire smoke rose steady into the sky, carrying with it the memory of the woman who had entered his life by accident, yet changed it forever. As he rode, the desert no longer felt as empty as it once had. The wind still howled. The land still carried scars, but inside him, something had shifted. He carried her strength with him now, her fire, her reminder that even the loneliest cowboy could find a reason to keep riding, and though the trail ahead remained uncertain, he no longer feared it. For the first time in years, he believed that somewhere on that endless horizon, there might still be a place for him. The sun sank low, painting the world in gold and crimson, and the cowboy rode on, his heart no longer hollow, but alive with the echo of a bond he would never forget. Top of form, bottom of form.